Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Furman and racing analyst Chris Wormy.
Welcome into the Stay Green podcast, a Bet the Board production, part of the Wondery Podcast Network. And boy, do we have an outstanding show for you. A little bit unorthodox, though, as loyal Stay Green listeners have grown accustomed to us going Stage 1, Stage 2, and Stage 3 with traditional breakdowns in terms of reviewing the race we saw last. We'll, of course, have that. But for Stage 2 today, we have an outstanding interview, and it went a hell of a lot longer than we anticipated with one of the best names in NASCAR, Larry McReynolds, extremely generous and gracious with his time. And Stage 3, well, spoiler alert here, Chris and I are going to tell you why we don't like to bet Talladega, but that won't stop us from sharing a best bet. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined, as always, by my esteemed racing colleague and analyst, Chris Wormy. And Wormser, great interview we recorded earlier with Larry Mack. I can't wait to share it in Stage 2 with all of our loyal listeners.
Oh, it was awesome. I mean, I respect Larry's opinion, as much as anybody. So it was really cool to kind of interact with him, someone that we've seen on TV and someone where I've kind of heeded his advice multiple times during races, and, it's helped make me money. So it was just really cool to have someone that, not to hate on some of the other people we've had, but Larry Mack is a really, really cool person to kind of interact with, and obviously knows, like you said right before we started the show, he's forgotten more than we'll ever know about the sport of NASCAR. It's a lot of fun to have him on.
Exactly. It's such a different perspective. And we look at some of the guests that we've had already on the show. I mean, Danielle Trotta has been in and around the sport as an analyst and a host on TV for years. I mean, Bob Pockrass, his reputation speaks for himself as a journalist and how much he knows about the sport and the inner workings of things. Of course, Brian Murphy right there getting dirt under his fingernails on the front line at Stewart-Haas Racing. Regan Smith, who spent time winning races at the Cup level in Xfinity. And here we finally have a crew chief. So the next step, Worm, is we're going to have to get a team owner on in some capacity. And I know we're aggressively pushing for that. So if any race fans out there do have access to team owners and current drivers, by all means, pass along their contact info. We're happy to give them a little bit of airtime.
Yeah, I'd love to have an owner on. Obviously, we have one in mind that we think would be great for our listeners, and especially for kind of the future of the sport. So hopefully we can kind of make that happen slowly but surely. But either way, man, Larry Mack was awesome.
Yep, and we will
great to have it.
And we will get to that interview in a few. But as we always do for Stage 1, a brief recap of what we learned, or maybe what we didn't learn this past weekend at Martinsville. And Worm, I'll be honest, watched that race in its entirety, all 400 laps. Went back and watched it, on 1.5 times speed later that night. And I still sit here in the middle of the following week and couldn't tell you what cars were good, what cars were bad, because I'm convinced we could have taken a car out of your garage, put it out there in clean air, and there's a good chance that you could have led 300 laps yourself.
Yeah, I put that out as a Twitter poll, like who was the best car, and not out of spite, like we didn't have Larson. It was just one of those things where Larson just kind of had the right strategy at the end. I mean, if you look throughout the race, there was a point when I thought Alex Bowman was going to win by 5 seconds, and so did other crew chiefs as well. They were very worried about the 48. There was other times when I was like, well, this is Denny's race, he's finally in control, and then it was nope, now it's Harvick's race, he's finally in control. And then you have someone like Joey Logano, who had a terrible car, end up finishing in that finishing second. So it was an up and down day. I thought Chase Briscoe at times was really good. It was nice to see Stewart-Haas out there leading a lot of laps. At one point, Ryan Preece was great. It was a 400 lap race, but I would say that depending on what lap you were watching, another driver had the best car on track at that point.
And that was the whole thing. I mean, the one issue is we kind of get to the quarter pole this year. We've seen passes a little deeper in the field. We can be critical of what we've seen at short track so far this season. But the one challenge that feels like it's been consistent, unless you're on a different strategy or you're going about things in a different manner when it comes to your tires, like we aren't seeing green flag passes for the lead. So you better be sharp in terms of getting to your pits. You better make sure you get in and out of those pit stops in 10 seconds flat and make sure that you're on the optimal strategy, because the margins for error right now in the second year of the next gen car are absolutely narrow, and it's not like the other series where you can make up all those valuable positions on ice.
Absolutely. I mean, there's very few cars that were making passes throughout the day. You know, even the guys that started towards the back, you know, maybe Blaney early on was decent at making passes. I would say where we were wrong was I thought Chase Elliott was going to be a little better. And, you know, the expectation of him coming back, obviously it's great for the sport. His lap times in practice were good. I thought he would qualify a little better. You know, if I could look back, I know that we gave out Chase over Logano at minus 135 or minus 140. And looking back, if I had known how bad Logano was going to be, that would have been a much bigger bet for us. And by the way, I would have faded him with every other guy I could have, knowing the kind of car he had. But this is NASCAR. This is not golf where you someone can just miss the cut and you win your bets. I mean, the first half of the race, Logano was just trying to stay on the lead lap. However, you know, he had to throw a Hail Mary, and this is what Paul Wolfe is great at doing. He takes calculated risks, and he stayed out. And the other thing is, whenever you're staying out longer on a green flag run, you are waiting for exactly what happened. That caution where you stayed out, everyone else pitted to inherit this track position. Now, the interesting thing is, I said earlier this year, if you pit early in a green flag cycle, there is a good chance you will have a loose wheel, and that will bring out the caution. And sure as shit, that's what happened this week. And it definitely flipped every one of our matchups, went from winning to losing. And with 80 laps to go in the race, it's really hard to overcome that. So I'll sit here and say I wish I had faded Logano more, knowing the kind of car he had. However, where I was wrong is I thought Chastain was going to be a little bit better along with Ryan Blaney. I thought those guys would work their way up to the field. But you know what? It's just hard to pass these days. And you get strung out, and you maybe can pick up one or two spots. So if you're not aggressive with strategy, it's really hard to make it to the front.
You know who the big winner was with that loose wheel and that pits, basically that caution that flipped the entire race upside down? It was Andy's Custard, the paint scheme on Anthony Alfredo's 78 car that got showcased live on air for the first time being relevant because it completely had a negative impact on the way the race unfolded. But again, you got to stay on track. I mean, that's the name of the game, and hope for that Hail Mary if you don't have a race-winning car.
We should sponsor a car, like just a car that's going to finish last, and be like, hey, listen, with 50 to go, I need you to wreck the leader. So that way you at least show up on TV and get some airtime.
Yeah, I'll leave you to pay the fines for that being the case and the points deduction and everything else that comes along with it. But we rambled enough on Martinsville. We, of course, will have plenty of great races to talk about in terms of things that we actually can learn and apply going forward as soon as the Monster Mile at Dover next week, or whatever they're calling it. Monster Mile, is that New Hampshire or is it Dover? I can never keep those things straight. But
you're right, Monster Miles.
But before I get things confused around these parts, we teased the interview with Larry McReynolds for Stage 2, and there's no reason to hold back here. You know, this is the part of the program we really look forward to. Obviously, Chris, you and I teased some of the things that we learned or didn't learn last week at Martinsville. Talladega is a de facto off week for us, and we handicap things. So what better way than to bring in an Alabama native that every NASCAR fan knows? His resume speaks for himself. You can see him on the Fox telecast on Race Up during the week. You can see him on race day. You can follow him on Twitter at LarryMac28. And Larry, you didn't think for a second, though, we were going to welcome you in here and give you softball NASCAR questions, because I know you live and die with Alabama football during the fall as well. You know, when do you start to get nervous that old Kirby has passed Nick Saban by and Alabama's playing second fiddle, not just in the SEC, but in all things college football right now? You guys got to be pretty worried down there in Titletown.
You know, if my Crimson Tide can't win a national championship right now, I'm happy for Kirby Smart. You know, Kirby Smart is just a class act guy. He did a lot the years he was the defensive coordinator for the Crimson Tide, and I got so much respect and admiration for him. Yeah, it's a little bit tough pill to swallow. I don't mind saying, but at least we're keeping that national championship trophy in the SEC. Of course, the way we're going, give it a few more years, I think Oregon's going to be in the SEC. The SEC will be nationwide. So, but yeah, it's we've been going through a little rebuilding. I mean, my gosh, you look at this last year, we lost 2 football games, and they were, I think, both of them either on the last play or the next to the last play of the game by a total of 4 or 5 points combined. So, I guess when you're disheartened about that, you really don't have a lot to be disheartened about.
Yeah, it's pretty wild when the gold standard becomes winning national championships and the fan base is crestfallen because you lose on a last-second field goal at Neyland Stadium under the bright lights there, and then old Brian Kelly gets the best of them. So things will be just fine. We know the recruiting class that Nick brought in, so I'm pretty sure you'll be just A-okay in the fall when we see Alabama out there on the football field again. But all right, let's get into some of the NASCAR stuff, and thrilled to get you on. Looking forward to talking to you. But before we get into some of the brass tacks, the X's and O's, you're obviously synonymous with nicknames in and around NASCAR. America's crew chief, we know, is the affectionate moniker that everyone refers to you by, the 4 Mr. Feelgoods that we like to see some of these drivers put on. Larry's Trends, Larry's McNuggets, everything else. Can you walk us through some of the evolution of where the America's Crew Chief nickname came from, Mr. Feelgoods, and everything else you've been able to accomplish in your illustrious time, both obviously as a crew chief and now as a fixture in the Fox broadcasting booth?
Well, I really can't take full credit for the 4 Mr. Feelgoods. That was a DW-ism, and DW had a lot of isms. DW fabricated a lot of words in the 15 years that I stood beside him in that Fox booth. So that was kind of his deal that he came up with, no different than Boogity, Boogity, Boogity. America's crew chief, Adam Alexander, just like falling out of the sky, out of the clear blue one day, put that nickname on me, and it was one of those nicknames that just stuck. Honestly, it's very flattering. That's a pretty big role to fill. But yeah, that totally came from Adam Alexander, and it just absolutely stuck. Larry McNuggets, it kind of came about when I started doing Sirius XM NASCAR radio a few years ago. We wanted to come up with a segment, and Brad Gilley, who I was co-hosting with at that point on the late shift on Monday and Tuesday nights, he one night said, we've got some Larry McNuggets that Larry's been cooking up about the upcoming race weekend. And now Danielle Trotta and I, we're in our 5th year with the On Track on Sirius XM NASCAR radio. We're on 11 to 1 Eastern time every weekday. So, and now this year, we came up with Larry Mac Strategy. Every Thursday, we unfold the strategy for the upcoming race weekend. So I guess just having a last name with Mac on the beginning of it, that you can kind of turn anything into it. Mac Nuggets, Mac Strategy, Mac whatever.
I got to ask one follow-up before I'll let Chris get into some of the racing stuff. And you can be honest with us here, Larry. It's a safe space, and Danielle was extremely generous with her time to come on for our season opening episode of Stay Green Season 2 to talk at the preview. Is it tougher for you to work with her on a day-to-day basis, or does she have to endure a little bit more working with you for 2 hours every day during the course of the year?
Danielle and I have such a long history together. Sometimes I look at her like my daughter. Sometimes I look at her like my sister. We hit it off from the very beginning, going back to the speed days, and then of course transitioning to FS1. And I think she knows my weaknesses and my strengths, and I know her weaknesses and strengths, which honestly she has very few weaknesses, but we just kind of complement each other. It almost reminds me of some of the drivers that I had a really good relationship with, Todd and Chris, that she can almost finish some of my sentences and I can almost finish some of hers. We hit it off from the beginning, and hopefully we're together for many more years to come.
No, it's a great listen, and can't encourage our listeners enough. I know a lot of them are gamblers by trade, and they've developed a passion for NASCAR over the last, season and a half that we've been doing this show, kind of learning some of the ins and outs. So encourage you guys to check that out, 11 to 1 Eastern on NASCAR radio on Sirius XM. But Chris, all right, you get to fire some of the actual racing questions Larry's way. I sit here, I'm going to start taking notes because I know I'm going to learn an awful lot from you too.
Yeah, Larry, thanks for taking the time. This is pretty cool for me. As someone that's kind of paid attention to the sport very closely for the last 12 years, I always say it's nice having you in the booth, getting well-informed information to the fans. So I'm happy to have you on. I have a couple questions. The first one would be, in this day and age, would you rather have all the benefits of a short run car in a race? Would you rather have a long run car, or would you rather just be on the right strategy? And then think of all the things that go into that. Like short run car, you're obviously going to qualify well, get that good pit stall. Whereas long run car, maybe you're qualifying 20th with a 20th place stall. Or would you just rather say at the end of the day, I just want to be on the right strategy? Which one of those three things would you prefer in a race car in this particular car?
Yeah, I think, Chris, the way I've seen these first 9 races unfold, I want to have the right strategy. I go back to Martinsville. Joey Logano, Paul Wolf, the 22 car. They did. I don't even know if they had a top 15 race car, but they ran that long green flag run long and caught a caution before they had made their green flag pit stop. They pulled strategy on that last caution with 30 laps on their tires and elected to stay out. And that you talking about turning lemons into lemonade. Yeah. They took about a 16th place race car and came home with a second place finish. I look at what Hendrick has done this year. When you look at Kyle Larson's win at Martinsville, going with those 2 tires, going back to Phoenix when William Byron won the race, going with 2 tires. So, yeah, I'm greedy. I want it all. I want a long run car. I want a short run car. I want perfect strategy. But based on what I'm seeing this year, I just want to be on the right side of strategy, and that's probably going to get you to victory lane.
Yeah, that kind of ties into another
I would say,
question.
Chris, I'll let you go in a second. It's almost like Larry knew exactly who we had in our head-to-head matchup, that we bet NASCAR's most popular driver in Chase Elliott over Joey Logano. It was as though he was a third party with listening in on our introduction to the show, and he wanted to throw salt in the wounds, talking about Joey Logano flipping his race. Yep. The one thing I'll say to Larry, though, calling the 22 a 16th place car might be generous, given the comments that he offered up after the race, saying he was just lucky to finish on the lead lap. And that's nothing you hear, knowing the competitive drive from the 22 and how close he was to being multiple laps down. If early on in the race, Ryan Preece in stage 1 is able to pass Ross Chastain, he ends up pinning the 22, and Joey spending the entire day working his way back on the lead lap. But I didn't mean to cut you off, Chris.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of ties in with, the next question. Is, do you have an expectation? Joey obviously struggled a little bit in practice. You could tell that. Then they had to go to the rear. And, at Martinsville, the leaders are going to be coming quickly. And to stay on the lead lap is really important, obviously, to get a decent finish. I'm wondering, and Ryan Preece is a great example of this. We've seen Ryan Preece actually have very competitive cars the last 2 weeks, and he's had horrible finishes relative to how good his car was. Whereas if you rewind to, Phoenix and Las Vegas, I thought Ryan Preece really, really struggled in practice and in qualifying, and was able to get decent finishes because their expectations were so low. Now all of a sudden they have race winning cars. They're up there beating and banging with the leaders, and he can't get a good finish. Is there an expectation where, you know what, if you're Joey Logano and let's just say you're an 18th place car going into the race, that's kind of your idea. If you can find yourself in the top 10, hey, we'll take it. We'll move on to next week, versus, hey, we have a race winning car. We have to do everything we can to win the race. Is there like a different mentality that a crew chief or a team has, knowing what the car that they have for that weekend? Does that change week in and week out?
I go back, Chris, to my 18 years as a crew chief, and outside of winning the race, slide the win aside. But I was much more excited and happier and more fulfilled on days where we maybe took a race car that wasn't what it should be and really overachieved with it. I was probably more fulfilled with that than on days we had a top 5 car and finished in the top 5. It's so hard today. The competition is just so spot on. I mean, go back to last year, 19 different winners. That's unheard of. 9 races this year. We've had 7 different winners, and look at the drivers that's not found victory lane. But if I was Ryan Preece and Chad Johnson's crew chief, I'd have been pretty disappointed about Martinsville, because it looked like to me that first stage, and even beyond that first stage, The only driver that could beat Ryan Preece was if Ryan Preece beat Ryan Preece. And you know what? Ryan Preece beat Ryan Preece. He got busted for speeding on pit road. To win these races today, there's an old line. Remember the movie Friday Night Lights, when the team went up against that team that was much better they were, and what the coach told them? Be perfect. You know what? That's almost what you have to be today to win these cup races. You got to be perfect on the racetrack. You got to be perfect with being mistake-free. You got to be perfect with your pit stops. You got to be perfect with your strategy. And that was just one of those days when you've got that many drivers on the lead lap. We had 35 of the 36 drivers that started that race at Martinsville still on the racetrack with a checkered flag wave. And it's just going to be hard to overcome a pit road speeding penalty. Honestly, I'd have been disappointed if I was at Stewart-Haas Racing, period. Yeah. Those 4 drivers, they all qualified inside the top 7. They collectively led 264 of 400 laps and barely got one driver inside the top 5. Yep. And that was Briscoe that ended up finishing 5th. Almirola finished 6th. Harvick and those guys beat themselves with the loose right front on the last caution. And then we talked about Preece and the pit road speeding penalty.
It's so wild, Chris, when you ask Larry that and listen to his response in terms of trying to figure out everything it takes to win a race with this level of parity. Obviously, it's what NASCAR wanted from the next-gen car. They wanted a lot of these teams to have a playing field leveled. Larry, are you surprised by how much some of the so-called elite drivers are pushing back on it? We know Denny Hamlin's been pretty outspoken about looking for a better tire compound that really highlights driver skill sets, so we get some of those comers and goings, and it puts a little bit more of these outcomes into the driver's hands? Or do you think NASCAR is kind of the perfect mix now where, hey, look, the driver can do everything he does, but it may still not be good enough to win the race if his pit crew doesn't do their job, and vice versa, knowing that it really is a full 360 all hands on deck type effort to kind of win some of these cup races, unlike what we see, with the separation of the have-nots and the Xfinity Series, or of course the trucks?
Yeah, I mean, Todd, there's no doubt. The racing at Martinsville was entertaining. Did we see drivers driving all over the top of each other and wrecking each other? It was a race that only had 5 cautions, and 2 of those were for stage ends. But to me, it was still an entertaining race. But with that said, I do think we still have work to do on our short track package. I think we've improved it with the lower downforce, with the 2-inch rear spoiler and some things that's been taken away underneath in the rear diffuser area. But I still think there's work to do. But, Robert Yates, that I worked for 6 years, he taught me so many things. And one thing he told me, don't focus on what you don't have, focus on what you've got. That's the people that will prevail. And I've got a lot of respect for Denny Hamlin. No doubt he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. It's blows my mind the man has not won a Cup Series championship. But here's a guy that's being very vocal. He hadn't been to victory lane in almost 11 months. Let Kyle Larson tell me what he thinks. Let William Byron tell me what he thinks. Let Tyler Reddick tells me what he thinks. Sometimes I think people get caught up in what they don't have versus just working on what they do have. And that might be the reason that Denny Hamlin's not been to victory lane in almost a year. Call it 11 months. The Coke 600 last May. Again, I don't mean to be derogatory or negative toward Denny. I got a lot of respect for him. But maybe quit focusing on what we don't have and focus on what we do. And the results may end up being a little bit different.
It's such an interesting time for the sport on a variety of fronts, because as fans and bettors, obviously, anytime you introduce a new variable, it's great for the equation for Chris and myself, because we can identify an edge sometimes faster than some of the folks in the garage, not knowing exactly what kind of machines are there. And there's no doubt we bitch and moan when it becomes a track position race above all else. And when you see the field get completely flipped upside down because Anthony Alfredo is the one impacting the overall race product that we see. But I know it's great for fans. They love stage racing. They love to see some of the competitive balance out of it. And you try and figure out, how to create that best product for the drivers involved, the teams, to try and get that infusion of fresh capital out there, which has been outstanding. To see what Justin Marks has brought to Trackhouse when he took over for Chip Ganassi Racing, to get guys like Michael Jordan, the star power that Denny was able to facilitate with 23XI. So for outsiders like Chris and I, we look at it and go, you know what? We'd almost like a race. Sometimes it's a snoozer if we can identify the best car and they go out there and leave 400 laps. But to be candid, probably not what NASCAR's after. It would make for an awfully boring telecast for you, Shannon, and Jamie to have to fill some of that airtime out there. We can only listen to Clint Boyer talk too much before we got to turn down the mic a little bit, and Mike Joy's got to step on his toes some.
He actually his mic went out during the Martinsville race, and I thought to myself, "Oh my Lord, there is a God." No, I love Clint to death, but obviously, my attitude changed when I went from becoming a crew chief to a broadcaster in 2001. I think Jeff Gordon's outlook changed. Clint Boyer's outlook changed. I got to be brutally honest. When I was a crew chief, Chris and Todd, I lobbied for all kinds of stuff. But you know what the stuff was I was lobbying for? What would help Larry Mack? I didn't care. I'm just being honest. I didn't care if there was 25 people sitting in the grandstands. As long as Larry Mack's race car was leading and winning, that's all that mattered to me. And I guess case in point, there's no doubt the drivers, the crew chiefs, the current ones, they have the interest of the sport at heart because a rising tide lifts all ship. But Bill France Jr. always had a saying, if the drivers don't like it, it might be the best thing we can do because that's probably going to be the best for the show. It might not be best for that driver, but it might be the best thing for our show. So sometimes I think you have to sift through what the drivers are lobbying for because it may not be the best thing for the sake of the sport or for the sake of a good race on Sunday.
Oh, I'd be looking out for number one first and foremost. There is no doubt. And if I was in your spot, Larry, I'd be doing the exact same things. I could care less about competitive balance, and I'd want to make sure that I could put my race car on the pole each and every weekend and go out there and absolutely snooze the field. But Chris, I know I cut you off. I wasn't sure where you wanted to go.
I just kind of wanted to kind of keep asking questions about just this particular season. I guess outside of William Byron, good or bad, what's the next biggest surprise of the season? And that, like I said, it could be good or bad.
Oh, wow. That is a tough question.
Well, can I answer what mine would be? Because I'm really biased. I got to throw this in. So I was really high on Kyle
here we
Busch
go.
this year.
Larry, I
can't help it. I can't help it.
This is going in one direction and one
Kyle
direction
Busch.
only. It's all Kyle Busch. Go ahead, Chris. You can promote Kyle Busch's struggles. Go ahead.
So I guess I should say, who's your biggest surprise, good or bad, and why is it Kyle Busch for the bad? I guess it should be the question. I just thought Kyle was going to have a better season, especially coming out and having a great race at Fontana. We haven't even seen him be really competitive outside of a distant third place car at Coda and, probably a distant third place car at Bristol. Other than that, we haven't seen him be in the top 5 outside of those couple races. So I guess that would be my biggest kind of shock to the bad, because I thought that Reddick was faster in the 8 car last year than we're seeing in Kyle Busch this year in the 8. So that would be my surprise kind of to the bad side of things, but I didn't know if you had another one.
Well, and think about this, Chris, and I realize Daytona is kind of an animal of its own, just like Talladega, but he was one caution away from maybe winning his first Daytona 500 back in February. A lot of mistakes, go back to Martinsville. They never overcame. We talked about Ryan Preece and the speeding penalty. They never overcame that equipment interference. Kyle Busch, I think maybe the first 3, 4, 5 races, I think he had a pit road speeding penalty almost every single week. So there's a lot of things that they need to clean up. But I go back to the talk about Denny Hamlin and his teammate Martin Truex Jr. Can you believe we just came off of race number 9 at Martinsville? And that was both of them's first top 5 finish of the year. Yep. It's one of the deepest parts of the season that Denny Hamlin's ever went without a top 5 finish. Now, he and Martin, they've completed every single lap of every race this year, and we're 4th of the way through 2023. But hard to believe those two drivers. In fact, headed into Martinsville, Ty Gibbs, the rookie, he had the same number of top 10s that Denny and Martin had combined. 4 top 10s, and that's all that Martin and Denny had prior to Martinsville. I tell you another little bit of a surprise. Legacy Motor Club. I realize that Noah Gragson is a rookie, and I've always said the longest distance between 2 points is the Xfinity Series garage and the Cup Series garage. It's a short walk, but it's a huge gap. So, but I'm not even using him as my measuring stick. Eric Jones in that 43 car, they won the Southern 500. Even though they were not a part of the playoffs, they were pretty solid through those last 10 races last year. I think he had like 4 top 10s in the playoffs, including that win in the Southern 500. And now he and Noah Gragson combined 9 races, 1 top 10 finish. 1 top 10. Noah, I know he's a rookie, but he only has 2 top 20 finishes. A best finish of 12th at Atlanta, and Atlanta is the only top 10 finish at Eric Jones. I don't know that I expected those 2 to be knocking the gates off of victory lane, but I really expected a whole lot more. Yeah. And I know Jimmy only ran Daytona and only ran COTA, but not a lot of fruit bared there either with that 84 car.
Oh, and he was bad at COTA too. I mean, we faded him in every matchup we could. I mean, let alone just I think it was a lap 1 wreck.
Yeah.
But that team's just not where they were last year. It's almost like a step backwards. And I'm really high on Noah Gragson long run. I think that he's kind of a wheelman. He could find himself, and you get in a high line race. I'm interested to see how he does at a place like Homestead where, the tire fall off in the different line. It's kind of like a great equalizer. But yeah, those are 2 good points on. I can't believe Truex, especially because he went out there and won the Clash. It's like, whoa, okay, new year, new Truex, and been really disappointing. And obviously, the flip side of that would be Hendrick Motorsports. I mean, you look at just their fastest laps. I mean, they're the fastest thing, week in and week out, winning in the most competitive on all tracks, right? You could go from a road course, you go to a dirt track, you go to a short, you go to Fontana. I mean, I think Kyle Larson could have easily won Fontana if he stays in that race. So who's going to be, if we fast forward to November, who's going to be, what team or what car is going to be able to compete with Hendrick Motorsports?
A couple of guys that I've got my eye on, we've talked about Joe Gibbs Racing. We talked about Hamlin and Truex, Christopher Bell and Adam Stevens. The last 4 times that Coach Gibbs went to victory lane and got to celebrate and take his picture was with Christopher Bell. He's by far the winningest driver at Joe Gibbs Racing right now over the last, call it, year and a half. I think that he could be a player in this whole deal. And I'm going to tell you what, I know it's his last season, but I'm still not ready to write off Kevin Harvick. I think that group right now, they're just kind of hitting the ball right down the middle of the fairway.
Yeah.
But that's what Kevin Harvick does, right down the middle of the fairway. And I'm not sure about last year's champion, Joey Logano. They've got the super speedway stuff down. He finished second in the Daytona 500. He won Atlanta Motor Speedway, probably will be tough at Talladega, but I talked to Paul Wolf, his crew chief. He said, we got work to do at the intermediates, and we've got work to do on the short tracks. Once we leave Talladega, outside of the All-Star race at North Wilkesboro, I'm anxious to see those 4 intermediates. We've only run 2 intermediates this year. We've run Fontana and Las Vegas, but we've got Dover, we've got Kansas, we've got Darlington, and then we got the Coke 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway. When we get through those wave of races, I think the picture becomes a little clearer about who the players are truly going to be moving forward.
Yeah, that is.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say that's a good point. We've had such the difference in racetracks. Now we're getting into, okay, we're going to revisit some of the same tire compounds and some of the similar configurations to get an idea of, hey, this wasn't just a one-off. And not that I think that it is for Hendrick Motorsports, but, if you have to pick, I guess to comment on your Harvick, last year he was good on the long run at almost every track that you expected him to be good at. This year he's starting to qualify a little bit better. It's like it's only maybe a matter of time where they start to get this maybe top 2 or 3 qualifying position, maybe even put it on the pole, go out there and have that clean air all day, because he's done nothing but pass cars the last 2 years because his qualifying's been so bad. So I agree with that Kevin Harvick, and it'll be interesting to see. I think Chris Bell is another guy who's just had consistent finishes, and he, my nickname for him is AI, not Allen Iverson, but artificial intelligence. By the end of the race, he just finds himself learning so much that he's able to get the best finish out of his car. Sorry to cut you off, Todd.
No. I think, you guys both hitting on Christopher Bell. I mean, Larry, our podcast listeners were sitting with a Christopher Bell ticket in hand last year to win the championship. And, obviously got their sweat equity out of it, knowing he had to win 2 elimination races to even make the Final Four in Phoenix. But, when you see him win on the dirt track at Bristol, his 5 wins over the amount of races it took put him in rarefied air alongside the Denny Hamlins and the Kyle Bushes of the world. And I don't think the casual fan necessarily looks at JGR and goes, you know what? Christopher Bell is probably that flagship driver there. He may not have as many wins under his belts, but he's starting to put together the consistent finishes. And you guys talked about a number of drivers. I want to get to the track mix in a second in terms of what we think about that. But a driver that Chris and I struggle with almost on a weekly basis because he typically unloads fast. We know the potential he has, but he hasn't visited victory lane in an eternity in a points-paying race is Ryan Blaney. When you watch the 12 on a week in, week out basis, are there things you're seeing or that you would expect to see from a driver that's building that memory bank that he's not able to go out there and execute because he has fast race cars? We've seen what Joey Logano has done in the 22, but the 12 can't seem to put it all together and grab himself that checkered flag.
Yeah. And, I thought 2 years ago, the last year that Todd Gordon was there with him, I thought that was a breakout year for Ryan Blaney because he finally won multiple races. Up to then, he was just winning that one race a year. And it's almost like we've drifted back to the old Ryan Blaney. Qualify, top 5, lead 130-something laps, win stage 1, second stage 2, and finishes 8th. Mm-hmm. Just can't close the deal, just cannot close the deal. And I know it has to be frustrating for him, and I know it has to be frustrating for his young crew chief, Jonathan Hassler. But I think if they can ever break that barrier, I think they can make things happen. Quite honestly, a lot like Joey Logano and Paul Wolf at Martinsville, they overachieved. To come home 7th, they overcame a lot. And we are headed to Talladega. I know we don't like handicapping Talladega. I know you guys, for the most part, take the weekend off. But he's the only guy that's won more than once there in the last 7 trips. And his last win was at a super speedway at Daytona back in August of 21.
So do you think his best place to win, his best chance to win, is a super speedway? If we're just looking at the next 5 races, you got, Dover, Kansas, Darlington, where he really struggles, Charlotte, and maybe Gateway. I know that last year the Fords were pretty strong there. But where do you think, if he's going to get his first win, where does it happen? I kind of thought Las Vegas and Phoenix, those are the two of his best tracks. And I kind of anticipated him being the fastest going into Phoenix. If he were to maybe get a win early in the season, this could be the start of maybe a 3 or 4 win year. But at this point, we're going to tracks that maybe don't fit him, as good as, Vegas or Phoenix. But where do you see him potentially getting his first win this year?
Well, again, if I was filling out a fantasy lineup for this weekend, he definitely would be in my lineup for Talladega. He finished 2nd when we were there back in the fall to Chase Elliott. Dover, I look for him to run awfully good at Dover. But again, I just think the Ford camp right now, Stewart-Haas Racing, RFK Racing, and that's, quite honestly, that's been another little bit of a pleasant surprise to see how they're starting to come together here in year 2 with Brad joining over there. And Team Penske, I'm really anxious to see them at those intermediate tracks that you just reeled off right there. I think that's going to be a telltale sign. If they can get Ryan Blaney to Phoenix in the fall as part of the Championship 4, he's finished 2nd there our last 2 trips there. He's never made the Championship 4. He's only been as far as the round of 8. But if they can somehow get to Phoenix, but they're going to have to start winning some races. Yeah. You can get there so far on points, but then you've got to figure out how to find victory lane, because that's, quite honestly, at the end of the day, that's the ticket to being there to race for a championship.
It's such an interesting dynamic because when you look at Blaney, both of your guys' points, we see him race with speed. We see how good he is when he's at the front of the field, but he makes that costly mistake. It's shuffled back, and whether it's lack of aggression or vision, look, I've never been behind the wheel of a race car, so it's hard for me to be critical of drivers operating at that top level, but just doesn't feel like you're confident that if he gets shuffled back to 15th or 16th, he's able to do what it takes to drive his way to the front of the field and ultimately grab that big win. But listening to you guys talk about the upcoming schedule, and Larry, we had Regan Smith on a few weeks ago, and it was great to get his perspective. When we look at the way the NASCAR schedule lays out, we can say what we want about the Bristol Dirt and the fact that these guys get one off week for 36 races. As far as the overall track mix, do you feel that NASCAR has landed on a bit of a sweet spot, that we have the right blend now of short tracks, intermediate tracks, road courses, super speedways? Or if there was something that if you were the commissioner of NASCAR for one day and you got to design the schedule, that you really like to see the sport change for the better?
Boy, Todd, if you'd asked me this about 5 or 6 years ago, I went, oh my gosh, there's a lot of stuff we need to do different. But honestly, I like the mix right now. And I like the way we lay it out, too. I like the fact that we have the West Coast swing with back-to-back races out west, especially in a time when the weather's not that great in other parts of the country. I like that we just kind of went through the short track swing, with Richmond, the Bristol Dirt Race, and Martinsville. I don't think we need to add any more road course races. We've got 6 now, including the Chicago street race, but I think that's a good mix. I even look at the playoffs, and I like the way that it's kind of mixed up, because it is a mixture of all the types of tracks that we go to. I think the only thing we don't have in the playoffs is a dirt race, but we don't need but one dirt race.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think I've been in the sport for over 40 years, and NASCAR can be one of the greediest sports there is. I always relate it to taking aspirin for a headache. If you really only need to take 2 to get rid of that headache, well, hell, I'll just take 10. That'll really get rid of it. And I think we've been guilty of that for many years with NASCAR. We did it with 1.5 mile tracks. We did it with lights. We did it with a lot of things. We got greedy, and we have to make sure we keep the concept that less is more. When you only have one, it keeps it special. When you end up with 2 or 3 or more, it's not special anymore. It's not, people don't look forward to it. And I like what we've done with the Bristol Dirt Race. I've already heard people going, oh, well, we need to go to the streets of Miami. We need to go to the street. No, we haven't even run one yet. Let's do Chicago first. Let's see how that goes. And if we want to move it around and have one a year on a street course, great. But we don't need to do 2 or 3. I don't care how good it ends up being.
Yeah, I mean, I think, listening to you talk and describe that thought process, getting the Clash out of Daytona, moving into the LA Coliseum was a big win. It showed that NASCAR could replicate that footprint and move it to metropolitan cities, whether it's LA, whether it's New York, and a variety of other spots in some of those non-traditional markets. I think was a major win for NASCAR. Now, do I like what the race has necessarily become when guys are just driving through the back of one another? Absolutely not. But, beggars can't be choosers, and we can be critical of some of the restarts that we saw at COTA, that we're going to see on the Indy road course, but that's probably a different discussion for a different day. We'll wait and see how things unfold in Chicago with that. And I do have to give NASCAR credit for as critical as Chris and I can be of the sport at times, and largely of the betting community and some of the options there, that the sport has gone away from its roots and outside its comfort zone, that it's looking to kind of expand the horizons. And we mentioned, the current track mix, especially in the playoffs. We're not happy that Talladega is one of those playoff races because it takes one off our plate, but I think it's the perfect way and that level of unpredictability that on a football Sunday, Talladega gets top billing in my household, in my man cave, to watch, to try and see who's going to be able to punch their ticket and move on to the next round, because you can't just sit back on your laurels and race for points, especially if you're on the cusp, even with those bonus points, knowing, hey, look, you may get a guy that's dead and buried at the back of the field, but they've got Talladega circled, and suddenly Ricky Stenhouse, who we all wrote off, may have a chance to continue moving on and dancing deeper into the postseason.
And, to me, Todd, stage racing that we started in 2017, awarding the stage points, awarding a playoff point for a stage win. And we know today how valuable every single point is all year long. We know how valuable every single playoff point is to put in your bucket, to have in your account when you get to the playoffs. And before stage racing, it wasn't unusual. Daytona 500, both the 500-mile races at Talladega, they'd get to about lap 30. Let's just go single file and run around the top of the racetrack, and let's just log some laps.
Yep.
That ship has sailed.
Yeah.
Because now these guys know about how valuable those stage points are and those playoff points for winning those stages. To me, stage racing was a game changer at a lot of tracks we go to, especially the road courses. But to me, it definitely helped the racing at the two super speedways, Daytona and Talladega.
You know, I want to come back to Talladega in a minute, but kind of switching gears, Larry, you obviously have your fingers on the pulse. You know, talk to all the guys in the garage. You know, I know the higher ups at NASCAR lean on you. You have the ears of the brass at Fox. We're, of course, a gambling show. And obviously, Chris and I look at the sport through a very different lens than someone that is a lifelong NASCAR fan that grew up with it in their DNA. Hell, I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. NASCAR was a 6-letter word that I had never even heard until Chris introduced me to the gambling side of it. But you kind of forced my hand a little bit in a very good way, that I'm following the sport throughout the course of the year, not just during the course of the season, but silly season as well, looking to try and stay engaged, watching a lot more laps and races in their entirety. When we look at the legalization of sports betting, we know there are a number of casinos attached to various tracks around the country, whether it's Dover, whether it's Hollywood Casino in Kansas City, Michigan. I can go on and on here. Do we think gambling is a valuable vehicle that NASCAR has leaned into enough, or that we should be doing more to go, hey, look, this is a unique perspective that we can provide for our viewers above and beyond, you know, those fans that have grown up in a NASCAR family where they were going to Darlington, they were going to Talladega at 4 and 5, and we know we're going to stick with them. But you know what? We can get to that 25 to 30-year-old crowd that grew up in New York City, that grew up in Los Angeles, and gambling can be the way that we can get them into the NASCAR community.
Yeah, I do, Todd. I really do. And, you know, I don't gamble. I don't bet on any kind of sport whatsoever. It's just not what I do. Certainly don't bet on NASCAR because I would feel very uncomfortable doing that being a broadcaster.
Yep.
But I can see where it's an important element. We see it in all other sports. You know, I've got a friend, one of my best friends. I don't know that he cares that much about actually NFL football games and college football games. But the reason he pays attention is because he bets on them. And I can see where it's a very important element, and that it would create more of a fan base that maybe wouldn't be attracted could they not wager on the races. And I guess there's so many ways to bet on NASCAR because we're not one team versus another team. Every single week, we have minimum of 1 versus 35 others. And then all the prop bets and all the other things that you can do, it's endless how you can make a wager. The way my race picks have been going on my own track radio show, I'm glad I don't gamble. I'd probably be eating out of a trash can, but I've not had a good year picking winners. That's for sure.
When I tell people,
go ahead, Chris.
No, when I tell people they ask, they're like, wait, you bet on NASCAR for a living? Like, I didn't even know that was a thing. I'm like, yeah, no one really knows it's a thing. You know, I just decided to tell people that I'm retired because I just made a hobby, and then all of a sudden has been able to monetize it so I can retire and then just bet NASCAR on the weekend. So I guess I'm just retired. But I always tell people that it's like betting the entire NFL season every weekend, because you have, you know, your pick to win the Super Bowl. Okay, who's your bet to win the race? You're able to, you know, pick a couple guys there. Then you have your head-to-head matchups. Those would be like your individual games. You know, you got the Falcons, Eagles, whatever. But then you have group bets. Those are like division bets. You know, you have the best driver of the 4. So I think that gambling is obviously that was the conduit that got me into the sport. And, you know, a lot of my friends that have kind of taken interest in the F1 side of things because of the TV show, I've like, hey, let's bet a few NASCAR races. And then you tell me what you enjoy more. And now it's every weekend I'm getting 30 or 40 texts like, hey, who we picking today? Because they're into the racing, you know. And then you throw in another element, which would be live betting, which is like during the race, you can start to make your bets. And that's a big portion of what I do, just watching the races. So I was wondering, is there any plan to incorporate some of the live options in broadcast potentially? And I know that you have to be careful. Like, you can't take an old school NASCAR fan and force betting on them.
Right.
But you know, is there a chance at a stage break where you could just kind of flash live odds and say, hey, you know, and actually have a conversation about who they think that can win the race? Because there's a lot of guys that'll just put the bets out and not watch the race. But if you have the opportunity for live betting, when someone goes to the rear for a speeding penalty and they go from 8-1, up to 12-1, that might be a great opportunity. So do you see that kind of taking place at all in the broadcast, or have you not heard anything about that?
Yeah, that's probably, Chris, a different floor than I work on at Fox Sports. I think it'd be a very cool element because, to your point, I think that's going to have more people paying closer attention to the race as it is unfold, because as we know, that's the neat thing about NASCAR is every single week, if you go to an NFL game and let's just say with 6 minutes to go in the game, the score's 35-10, you can go to your car and drive home and feel pretty good about what the results were. If you go to a baseball game and you're heading into the top of the ninth and the home team's winning 9-3, things can change, but you got a pretty good idea. I'm telling you, when you go to a NASCAR race, you guys know this, you better not leave those grandstands, or you better not turn that TV off until that checkered flag is waved, because we know how it can change. I went back last night, I may have mentioned this earlier, and as I do every week, I watched the Talladega race from 1 year ago. And I still don't know how Ross Chastain won that race. I mean, going through turns 3 and 4, it's like, oh, I mean, I obviously know now he did win it, but even rewatching it a couple of nights ago, I went, how did he do that? That's called NASCAR racing. That's called you just don't know until they've crossed under that checkered flag.
It reminds me, Larry, of when the CFL was operating under the marketing slogan, "No lead is safe." And I think NASCAR is probably the truest illustration of that. And that's kind of what led us to naming the podcast what we did, Stay Green, because Chris and I go, if these races stayed green, as much as we love getting you on the screen early during the spring and early portion of the summer to tell us that the trend suggests we're going to get a late race caution, which ends up flipping our portfolio upside down. If we could get long green flag runs for what we do, makes life a heck of a lot easier, because things tend to play themselves out the way that we draw them up through a lot of our research. And I feel that provides probably the proper segue. And we kept saying one question, but this may be the final one for me. We're not really going to make a strong case to handicap Talladega. So instead of Chris and I going into our long-winded breakdown like we normally would do in stage 3, we're going to flip the script, Larry. We're putting the onus on you, since you just said you watched last year's Talladega race, that we know there's favorites, long shots, and value picks, so to speak, within the betting odds and the pecking order this weekend. But who are a couple drivers you may have your eye on? I know you tipped your hand a little bit earlier saying that, hey, Team Penske has done things real well, RFK and such. But are there any other drivers, or even those guys, that you think are going to run real well this weekend if they can avoid the big one?
Well, normally when we look at Talladega, and a lot because of Team Penske, you do look at the Fords. They've won 10 of the last 15 races there. But with that said, we've had 5 races at Daytona and Talladega with this next-gen car. Yeah, Austin Cindric won the Daytona 500 right out of the box, but ever since then at Daytona and Talladega, it's been the Bowtie Boys. Ross Chastain won this race a year ago. Austin Dillon won Daytona last August. Chase Elliott won Talladega the last time we were there, and Ricky Stenhouse Jr., all in Chevrolets, won the Daytona 500. So to me, that's a little bit of an X factor. You look at our last 11 super speedway races between Daytona and Talladega, you guessed it, 11 different winners. But 2 drivers, if I did bet, Eric Jones, and he's probably a long shot at the truth be known, in that 43 car. He's got 3 consecutive top 10 finishes there. He led the white flag lap last year at Talladega and kind of got shuffled out with a block that went kind of bad on Kyle Larson in the 5 and ended up finishing 6. But he was so strong there last year. And, again, Eric Jones, we talked about Legacy Motor Club. I'm not sure what's going on, but you know what? Talladega can be the equalizer. But the guy you mentioned earlier, Ryan Blaney, he's the only repeat winner there in the last 7 races. He finished second when we were there in the fall. If I had to pick 2 drivers that maybe actually would be a little bit of a long shot, it would be Eric Jones and Ryan Blaney in that 12.
Chris, I'll give you last word in a second. One thing I will say, Larry, for all of the different nicknames that they've had fun picking and choosing with you with, Mac Nuggets, Mac Strategy. As long as you don't have to go by Larry Mac Fades in the gambling community, it means you're doing something right.
Yeah.
So we'll keep close tabs on those picks. We'll see how things are going. But Chris, I wasn't sure if there was anything you wanted to ask Larry, who has been overly generous with his time. We always budget Larry about 30 minutes for these guests. These discussions run longer and couldn't be more appreciative of you taking time out of your busy schedule to jump in. But Chris, go ahead. Final word.
No,
to you,
I'm just kind of curious who wins the championship this year if you had to pick right now.
If I had to pick right now, I like that 5 car. Right now, when you look at his 2021 season, the year he won 10 races, the All-Star race and the championship, I know you got to be careful reading too much into the tea leaves because things change. But right now, in a lot of categories, after 9 races, he's ahead this year of where he was in 2021, the year he won 10 races and the championship. I just think that bunch, they're going to be awfully dangerous. Think about Hendrick Motorsports. Martinsville was the first race weekend since race number 2 at Fontana that everything was normal. All 4 of their drivers were there. All 4 of their crew chiefs were there. They didn't have a penalty levied against them. They didn't have an appeal that was pending. It's the first normal weekend they've had since race number 2, all the way back in late February at Fontana, California.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, he's got the speed there.
Well, I think that, you can kind of get through the playoffs on strategy or having a long or short run car, but you cannot win a championship without speed week in and week out. And the 5 has had just speed. I mean, it could have easily won California, could have easily won Vegas. We could be looking at someone who's won on 4 completely different tracks this early in the season. I think it's tough to disagree with Larry Mac's choice there on the 5.
Remember, guys, you can follow Larry Mac on Twitter. That's at Larry Mac 28. He's an analyst on Fox NASCAR. You can listen to his daily radio show from 9 to 11 Eastern alongside friend of Stay Green, Danielle Trotta as well. But can't encourage you guys enough to hang on every word that Larry Mac shares from the moment they unload at the track until the moment that they interview the winner in victory lane. Larry, can't thank you for enough. I apologize, well, at least a little bit for busting your chops right off the top for Alabama. But the first game the Crimson Tide lose this fall, you'll be getting a note from me, and I'll go, see, Larry, Nick overstayed his welcome a little bit, and you guys may want to try a lure Kirby Smart back to Tuscaloosa. Well,
if you send me a text, if Alabama gets beat, do it early because there's a long list of people that bust my chops whenever Alabama loses.
Larry, that's the one good thing. That's the one good thing for Chris and I. We at least give it a 24-hour moratorium. We're not guys that throw salt in the wound. We know when people live and die with their bets and their sports teams that you give them that little window to feel bad and kind of nurse things back. But have a great race weekend. We can't wait to see what you have in store for us on the coverage this weekend from Talladega. And we will be rooting for Ryan Blaney and Eric Jones, so we can call them Larry Mac Bets around this park.
Larry McWinners.
All right, guys. Todd, it was great to see you. Been miss seeing you, and Chris, enjoyed hanging out with you guys.
Yep, thanks a lot.
Now that's talking NASCAR, Wormser. It's nerding out in every capacity, basically rapid fire at Larry Mac. No, he didn't want any questions or anything ahead of time. He said he wanted to have a free-form conversation, ask him about Alabama football, talk a little NASCAR, and lo and behold, a wealth of information. And I couldn't have been more thrilled that Larry was so generous with his time.
No, it was awesome. I could shoot your shit with Larry all day long. That was a lot of fun.
I'm not sure Larry feels the same way about you, though.
Well, he might not, but listen, if I'm shooting a shit with someone, it might be a one-way thing where someone's just sitting there maybe with earplugs in, and I'll still do some talking.
All right, on to stage 3 we go, and we obviously shared at the top of the show. We talked to Larry Mac about his drivers to watch at Talladega, and the main reasons we don't bet the race. I know it sounds like a broken record since we said it for the Daytona 500. We said it going to Atlanta, although honestly, I may actually have to handicap Atlanta the second time around. I know it's susceptible to the big wreck, but it feels like it's getting to a point, even after the first couple races there, that we'll be able to handicap it. But Talladega, Larry talked about how the bow ties have been better. We've had 11 different winners. Fords have had dominance in the past. And obviously, when you look at the odds board here, you have about 97 drivers priced as low as 10-1, depending on the book, upwards of 20-1. And it's a who's who of super speedway racing, from Joey Logano, Ryan Blaney, Denny Hamlin, Chase Elliott, William Byron, Ross Chastain, Brad Kay, Kyle Busch, Kyle Larson, Christopher Bell, Ricky Stenhouse, Bubba Wallace, Tyler Reddick, Chris Buescher. The list goes on and on. And I'm not going to say I sit here and I'm going to spit out mathematical probabilities with a model here, or I'm going to watch practice to try and give us an edge. So for me, quite frankly, I'm not going to be betting the race. I may have to take a small position, though, on the guys that Larry mentioned, just because if they win, I want to give him his due process.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I definitely like what Larry had to say about Ryan Blaney and his chances this week. Unfortunately, Ryan Blaney is not much of an underdog this week. I think he's kind of pretty consistently a favorite along with Joey Logano, which is very understandable after that run that he had in Atlanta. What I did like, the discussion on Eric Jones, he's 25 to 35 to 1. I think that if you're looking at some long shots, I do like Eric Jones. He had a chance to win here last year. And, as Larry Mack was saying, he's like, I don't know how he doesn't win. But that's speedway racing. And the other guys that I do think might warrant some plays is, depending on the price, is I've seen some Brad Keselowski upwards of like 17 to 1.
Yep.
I do think that if RFK is going to get a win here in the short term, it's going to have to be at a super speedway type track. I think that he's obviously really talented here at Talladega. And I think that the final guy that I think maybe is worth nibbling that I've seen in anywhere from 45 to 60 to 1, I think that FanDuel had 60 to 1, was Ryan Preece. And I know that he's been, when we bet on him, he looks good and has a terrible finishing position. And when we bet against him, he looks terrible, but just kind of grinds out a good finish. So I think that I don't like that 45 to 1 as much as I like that 60 to 1. I think that SHR has a little bit of momentum coming off after last week. I know that it's just Martinsville and it's completely different, but hey, you got all 4 of those cars qualifying in the top 10, which is something that they haven't done in a long time. I do think there's a little momentum in that 41 camp. And if, coming down to that last lap, if you're in the top 6 or 7, you have a chance to win this race, and Ryan Preece certainly could get it done.
And don't worry, if Ryan Preece doesn't win here, I have a race circled later in the summer where I will bet him in the outright market, assuming that he opens at a reasonable price. I'm not giving away that track right now because I don't need that thing to get beat up when it hits the betting board. When it ultimately does, I'm glad, though, you didn't offer up a bet on Riley Herbst at 100 to 1. I'm not sure we could go to the window with a ticket on Riley. But I do have to ask you, do you want to go back to the well with Corey LaJoie? He did well by our listeners at Atlanta with our pre-week best bet. And since we're not going to have any additions on Sunday, I know we haven't gotten to the best bet yet, but is this a spot where you think LaJoie can run it back the same way, or Daytona and Atlanta better suited for the way the 7 is running?
I haven't thought much about that, as I will not be giving out a pick for Talladega as a best bet. I have a different best bet in mind here. So,
curveball.
Yeah, I know.
Look at that. All right.
Curveball.
But, all right, then, you know what? We can close the book on Talladega. There's no reason for us to ramble about a race we don't want to bet on. For all of those out there that do tune into Talladega and are going to bet the race, we wish you the best of luck. Make sure, you go to your synagogues, you go to your mosques, you go to your churches, you pray to whoever you need to hope that Lady Luck is on your side on race day, because you're going to need to avoid the big wreck. But I will say one thing, Wormser, I am going to make it an effort for us to get down to Talladega next year for the April race. There's a radio station I do work with down there who's kind of extended the invitation, so we may have to take full advantage and see if we can survive some of the sights and sounds of Talladega Boulevard the night before a race. But all right, you teased it before we got there, and I had no idea where you were going with any of this stuff. So this is the portion of the program where we give folks an actionable element. Where are we going for a best bet this fine program?
Well, we're going to stick with what old Larry Mack said, and we're going to talk about a championship bet. Last year, we gave out Chris Bell that we were kind of talking about towards the latter part of the season. Earlier this year, I gave out Kyle Busch, and we definitely got the better number there. A little bit concerned as to, how that 8 car is running and just how the team is operating since Fontana. However, we're getting to the meat and potatoes of the season, and, hopefully they can get that thing turned around. But there's a guy that I want to highlight, and there's no reason to wait till after Talladega, even though I don't think he'll win this week, is Kyle Larson. Kyle Larson is low-key having an incredible season, and like Larry pointed out, better than his 2021 year, which was arguably the most dominant season that I've seen in my NASCAR short window of watching. Listen, look at these tracks coming up. You've got Dover, Kansas, Darlington, and Charlotte. I think we could see him win all 4 of those races. And I think that he's going to win 1, maybe 2 of those races after Talladega. So I think now is the time to pull the trigger on Kyle Larson at 6-1, pretty much spread across the board for that championship. I anticipate him after, in about a month or so, his odds being, that 3.5 to 4 to 1 range. So I think it's time we pull the trigger on Kyle Larson at 6-1 to win the championship.
Look at you over there, making a case for Kyle Larson this early in the year, trying to lock up the number.
Bold, right?
From Kyle to Kyle we go, and let's hope he's got enough playoff points that he's got in the bank. And worst comes to worst, if Kyle finds himself on the outside looking in an elimination race, we can always add to our position and try and take advantage. So instead of doubling down on Talladega, we're going to add to the championship portfolio with the 5-car, pair him alongside the 8, and we'll figure out what other drivers that we can identify going forward. Anything else that you would like to add before we close up shop heading into Talladega weekend?
No, for those of you guys, well, I guess for everyone that's going to bet the race, good luck. Shoot me a message or a tweet. Let me know who I'm rooting in. It's impossible for me to not turn on the last few laps of the race, and I still get nervous and curious as to who's going to win. And for those of you that are just taking the week off, I don't blame you. Enjoy it, and we'll get back to the grind next week at Dover. And there's another big thing going on next weekend. I can't quite remember, but
it's the podcast stops for no one. The podcast will stop in July when the second portion of the event that you're describing does take place. But yes, we will talk a little bit more about that next week. You can bust my chops accordingly, and we'll get into it. But the show must go on. Regularly scheduled Dover breakdown coming next Wednesday. You may just have more, or Thursday when it gets released. You just may have more work on your plate on race day for Dover to get me down for a variety of reasons. But we'll share all that with our loyal listeners next week. Again, special thanks to Larry McReynolds for taking an hour out of his busy schedule this time of year to stop by, make us all smarter about our NASCAR betting and our general NASCAR knowledge, and encourage all of you guys to follow Chris on Twitter at ChrisWormy15. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. And with a Kyle Larson ticket in hand, come the final race of the season in Phoenix, we'll hope he's finishing runner-up to the 8-car of Kyle Busch.